My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. Thank you for making the time to join us this evening. We have been meeting rather regularly and felt it was important to meet this evening to discuss some of the latest developments that impact us all. First, we will discuss the statement made by the American Medical Association. Additionally, we will discuss the most recent national news report on kratom produced by CBS. The Q&A is open, and I will now turn it over to Mac Haddo, our Senior Fellow on Public Policy.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome to everyone. And as Ryan said, you can just ask questions in the chat and we'll get to those. We want this to be a give and take discussion. The two topics that we have identified are obviously important and timely, and the purpose for which we convened this webinar. We want the kratom community to be aware of what's happening, why it's happening, and what some of the background is that led to some of these things that occurred. The American Medical Association House of Delegates last year at their meeting had reviewed and rejected a petition by, or a resolution submitted by the Mississippi State Medical Association, which called for the outright ban on kratom. And they wanted, obviously, to encourage, have the AMA encourage the DEA to schedule kratom. The reason, and we of course vociferously objected, because the information that was provided by the Mississippi State Medical Association was factually incorrect. They made claims that were not based in the statute, that were not supported by the science, and that were fundamentally wrong about kratom. And we can disagree about kratom. Our premise is that science should dictate the kratom policy, not the opinions of the FDA, and not the misguided and sometimes perverted outcomes of some research that's been done in the form of case studies, which are not reliable, not good science, and certainly nothing that the FDA does in the review of products would ever consider valid science to be a case report. And so we know that the AMA tried to cherry pick. The Mississippi Medical Association tried to cherry pick. Now, the fatal flaw last year in their resolution, in addition to being factually incorrect, was that they filed it late. And so they had to really work around some of the internal rules in order to get a dispensation for having submitted it late. And I think that the objections that we had, I think there were 35 legislators who signed a letter, and including some federal legislators as well, objecting to the AMA's consideration of that resolution based on what the resolution said, that the science was incorrect and that it really needed to be vetted more carefully. And so the AMA punted last year. This year, the Mississippi State Medical Association submitted the resolution. It was 515. They did it in a timely way. And they obviously wanted all the same things that they got last year. They learned a little bit about the challenges that we placed on the, specifically on the science that they were presenting. But essentially, what they wanted to do was to ban all over-the-counter sales of kratom. They did hedge and say they didn't necessarily want to criminalize it. But if you schedule a substance, it is by nature going to be criminalized. And they tried to say that they wanted it to be at a lower schedule than Schedule 1. But the truth is that there is only one opportunity for a substance like kratom that is not approved by the FDA as a new drug application for its scheduling to be anything but Schedule 1. So they didn't even understand the statutory requirements and the structure of the Controlled Substances Act. And these are professionals. You would think that they had looked at it more closely and prepared for it, but they failed to do so. But essentially, we, of course, responded. And we worked hard to convince the leadership at the American Medical Association what the specific defects were in the presentation by the Mississippi Medical Association. And understand, they're the biggest cheerleaders for a kratom ban in the state of Mississippi. They were joined at the House of Delegates by the Wisconsin Medical Society. And so it appeared that they had this strong push that was moving forward. And any of you were able to watch the testimony, it was biased, one-sided, and completely unfair in the way that they characterized the kratom issue. What happened was, after a lot of debate and consideration, the American Medical Association House of Delegates modified and amended that particular resolution. And what they came up with is a resolution that we concur with at the American Kratom Association. Now, it's interesting that, and this happens sometimes, people just misunderstand, but we jumped the gun. Some in the community jumped the gun and said, oh, well, the AKA is just doing terrible things because they are endorsing the requirement in the resolution that the FDA should schedule kratom and make it a prescription drug. That is not true. And yet it was repeated. And I saw it on the internet, and I saw that however well-intentioned it wasn't the right thing to do. Because trust me, the FDA scrapes every bit of social media every day. They have a huge staff that does this in order to gather ammunition to build against kratom. And they saw this division in the kratom community that was obviously based on inaccurate information. People didn't even take the time to read the resolution that was passed, match it against the one that was presented, and see the differences. And I know that some people rescinded after they saw it and they looked at it and they said, okay, well, we're gonna delete our post. The damage was done. And so I just encourage everyone to be far more careful in the future. We are not going to mislead you. There is no way that the AKA would have endorsed any kind of policy that called for kratom to be prescription only. What we did agree with is that kratom should be regulated by the FDA. It should. It is under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Everything under that law, it's either a drug or a food. And if it's a drug, it has to have a new drug application. If it's a food, it can be a conventional food, which kratom is generally not, although it has conventional food uses that have been documented in Southeast Asia for centuries. It can be a dietary ingredient. It can be a dietary supplement. It can be a botanical supplement, or it can just simply be a food that's not conventional. And the FDA regulates all of those things under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it was a no-brainer to say that we agree that kratom should be regulated by the FDA. We don't agree with the FDA's approach to kratom, obviously, but the law is clear in terms of its coverage for substances like kratom being regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And that particular provision went on to say, and its safety and efficacy should be determined through clinical trials before it can be marketed or prescribed as a treatment for any condition. That is a restatement of the provisions of the new drug application process. If you are going to market the product as a therapeutic agent that benefits you and cures a disease or treats a disease, then you have to have a new drug application on file, and the FDA would supervise that and require that clinical trials be done. But we have no problem that if any vendor wants to present and market their product having a therapeutic benefit, and we know that they're doing it, and it is one of the major targeting of the FDA for those companies that do that. We at the AK have in fact submitted over 75 complaints to the FDA about companies that are doing exactly that. We think those companies should be removed, or those products should be removed from the marketplace. And if the company persists and continues to do it, then they should be put out of business. We wholeheartedly support that. And that's not anti-kratom. We're trying to protect kratom's accessibility by consumers by making sure that it is regulated properly, and the enforcement mechanisms that are used by the FDA in order to eradicate improperly marketed substances are fairly and equitably administered. That's our goal. So any misunderstanding that occurred by anyone in the kratom community, and if you were misled because people kind of flared up after they saw our press release that we were suddenly doing something wrong, we really need to be more careful. We need to be more responsible about how we do it. We also applauded the provision that individuals who are using kratom for only personal use should not face criminal consequences. We also believe, by the way, that that the criminalization of the entire kratom community, which would be a requirement of scheduling, is something that's a very bad public policy and doesn't make any sense if you look at the overall issue of the war on drugs, which has failed miserably since the Nixon era. They also stated that individuals who are currently using kratom for pain management and other conditions should have access to appropriate medical care to manage their conditions and withdrawal symptoms if needed. One of the stigmas that's associated with the use of kratom in the medical community is that people are sometimes afraid to tell their doctors that they're using kratom. And the American Medical Association is in a key position to tell doctors that they should not have that bias and should not apply the stigma that comes with it to their patients. That's all that provision says, and we, of course, support that. And then, of course, the provision that said that the safety and efficacy of kratom should be determined through research and clinical trials and subsequently evaluated by the relevant regulatory entities for its appropriateness for over-the-counter sale and potential oversight by way of the Controlled Substances Act before it can be marketed, purchased, or prescribed. We agree. And you know what's happened? The relevant regulatory agencies are the FDA, and we know their position, but the wisdom of the Congress in enacting the Controlled Substances Act did not give the FDA unchecked power. It requires the concurrence of the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, and we know clearly where Nora Volkow, the director of NIDA, and the NIDA agency is. They believe that kratom can be a part of the solution, not the problem. They believe that kratom should be a harm reduction tool that's available to people that are struggling with these addictions. They know, based on the science, and science should rule here, that there are adulterated kratom products that are being used by people that cause horrible outcomes, including death. They know that. They know because they've looked at the scientific data that has been presented, and even the data by the biased FDA who evaluated that so-called death data. They've determined that those are all polydrug use or adulterated kratom products, or, and this is important, underlying health conditions. And Dr. McCurdy's added another classification to that, which is a part of the NIDA research effort, which says that there may yet be unknown interactions and substances that have not been, these novel products that have not yet been identified that are detectable by tests. So there's some things that we don't know, but we clearly know that kratom is not schedulable because it doesn't meet the criteria under the Controlled Substances Act for the 8 factors. And we know for a fact that NIDA has concluded that. We know that the Department of Health and Human Services, including Secretary Becerra, have acknowledged that there needs to be a lot more evidence and data collected before there could ever be a conclusion that kratom should be scheduled. And Secretary Becerra has assured the Congress that that won't happen unless that scientific data is collected. All of us should remember that when Dr. Joie issued his withdrawal letter on August 16th of 2018, he set the roadmap for the FDA to be able to prove that kratom should be scheduled. He identified exactly what kinds of studies should be done in order to determine whether or not it was a schedulable substance. He outlined for them the pathway for that to happen, and he gave them the specific scientific research that needed to be conducted. Here we are in 2023, and the FDA hasn't done one of those things. They cannot sustain by science any of the criteria that's necessary for scheduling. They can't produce it. They can't even horse it up very well because they've had the opportunity to do so and they failed at every turn when they do that. So we know that it's not schedulable. And of course, the crowning blow comes when the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, which was charged by the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs to evaluate kratom under a far lesser standard. International scheduling would have been possible for kratom if the evidence were there, even at a lower standard than what we have here in the United States. And the unfortunate thing would have been if the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence determined that it was that the science and the evidence supported in international scheduling, then we would have been compelled under the treaty obligation that we have as a member country to that treaty to schedule it here in the United States, or at least can commence the proceedings for that. We know, based on 12 independent scientists who are experts in the field of drug abuse and addictions, that it didn't even meet the lower standard for scheduling internationally. That's the crowning blow to the FDA. You would think that the FDA would now come to the table and say, okay, let's regulate kratom appropriately. But they haven't. They've doubled down. They hide from the facts that are there. And we know that because everything that's on the table that we have seen, and if the FDA had something better, they certainly would put it on the table. That's why we believe that the safety and efficacy and the science, as the AMA appropriately pointed out in their resolution, should dictate the way that kratom is regulated going forward. We know as a reality that the FDA is not going to regulate kratom fairly and equitably. We know that. That's why the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act, when it's refiled, and it will be done shortly, that's why we know that we'll be able to get a fair shake, because this very same model occurred back in the early 90s, which led to the passage of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. At the time, the FDA was misbehaving the same way they're doing with kratom now. They were claiming that there were dietary supplements out there that were killing people. And you know what? They were partially correct. There were badly formulated with dietary supplements with adulterants in them that were causing adverse events and deaths. No question about it. But they tarred the entire dietary supplement industry with the bad actors' activities with a very few products. And they made that sound like that was everything that was going to happen. And it took the American people rising up, and there were hundreds of thousands of phone calls that were placed, this is before emails, placed to the Capitol switchboard, so many that they shut down the switchboard. And in fact, the US Capitol had to reconfigure their entire phone system in order to accommodate that kind of an outgrowth or appeal from the public. And there were over 900,000 letters that were sent to Congress. That led to the unanimous approval of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which puts severe restrictions appropriately on the FDA in their administration and regulation of dietary supplements. That same kind of model has to be enacted, because we know, just as in 94, the FDA was unwilling to behave and to responsibly regulate dietary supplements. That's what they need to do with kratom. The Congress needs to do with kratom. Now, think about this. When the FDA failed to act, when they simply wouldn't responsibly regulate dietary supplements in the mid-90s, what happened today? You have today over 50,000 dietary supplements that are on the market that are being used by people to self-medicate, to improve their health and well-being, to manage pain, all kinds of conditions, all of which the Constitution guarantees us the right to do, as long as the vendor that's selling the products does not inappropriately label their products and convince you through illicit marketing that the benefits of the product for which there is no clinical trial data. But nothing restricts the American people from intelligently and responsibly using a product that makes them feel better, helps them to deal with some of the minor aches and pains, and to self-medicate. That's just the reality of the situation. And the FDA hates that. They hate that the American people do that without their regulatory control. So at the bottom line, the decision by the American Medical Association to reject the proposal by the Mississippi Medical Association was the correct public policy decision. We applaud it, we support it, and we are on record doing so. And any confusion that continues to exist, everyone should just, for those that are confused, look at the record and the data, and you'll find that this was a responsible action by the American Medical Association, and our support of it is indicative of why we think that this is the right structure for regulation of kratom going forward. Second issue that we want to talk about is the CBS News story, which I hope all of you have seen. This is the start of the free-for-all attacks on kratom. And you look at how biased it was. You had a couple of attorneys who are plaintiffs' attorneys that are ambulance chasing trial attorneys that are just trying to get quick settlements, make a buck on the backs of people who have suffered tragedies in their lives with the loss of loved ones. And they have helped to create the myth that the reason and the cause of those deaths is because of kratom. Now, I understand that these families also know that the medical examiners have looked at the circumstances and identified those deaths in large measure as metrogeny and intoxication. Those medical examiners simply need to look at the evidence and data, and they don't, because they're just making a guess. That's all that is, based on what they've seen. And kratom pops in the talk screen and they say, oh, well, that must be kratom intoxication, because guess what? I hear that from the FDA all the time. I hear it from trial attorneys. And by the way, if there's any doubt about whether trial attorneys can influence the actions of doctors, look at what happened at the Georgia Medical Association. Those same two trial attorneys that were on the CBS story were on a podcast with the Georgia Medical Association, excoriating kratom, telling all of the misinformation and expanding on the propaganda that the FDA has, and you have all these doctors and medical examiners and coroners listening to this. We complained and went to the Georgia Medical Association and asked for equal time. And strangely, they said no. We said, well, why wouldn't you want to hear both sides of the issue? And when we finally pressed hard enough, finally they acknowledged, well, those attorneys paid for that podcast. They paid in order to spread the disinformation. That's the tragedy. And when I offered to pay, they said, oh, well, it was an exclusive. So they signed an agreement that there couldn't be another counter podcast that would allow at least for an evaluation of what the facts are. That's disappointing. But again, part of the scheme and the tactics of the other side that we have to recognize and be willing to fight against. And of course, we would do that. The sad tragedy of this is that at the end of the day, there's one thing that we share with all of these families who have suffered these losses, and that is we want to know the truth. Now, I get it that most of those families are convinced, and there's a financial interest in doing so because they want to go after these vendors that sold the products for which their family member was consuming, and they're really not as concerned about what the real cause of death might be. And I get that. I understand it. I hope that they will take a broader view of this because we want to know the truth. My offer stands, and that is for any family that believes that kratom was the suspect substance, then we will be glad to have an independent expert evaluate the tox screen and the product to determine whether or not that death actually occurred. Now, it's true that I don't know, nor do any of us, all of the individual issues that are associated with some of these deaths. And I think they need to be examined, and the court system is there for that purpose. But I'll give you an example based on what was publicly available for the death in Florida of the woman that was consuming a kratom product that was in a Ziploc bag, and someone had written space dust on it. There was nothing else on that product. There was no labeling that identified what the content of that product was. There was no idea. No one could know whether or not that product was adulterated with some other dangerous substance, which occasionally happens. We don't know what was in the product, but that the company that manufactured that product didn't even show up in the court. And so is it any wonder that they lost? But we would love to have the opportunity to fully evaluate that product to determine, because we at the AK have opposed the use of that kind of packaging, that kind of slipshod manufacturing, not having good testing or documenting the testing that's available that can make sure that there aren't contaminants or concentrations of kratom products that are artificially and synthetically made into very dangerous products. Because obviously we want the kratom consumer to make informed judgments, to follow directions on the label. So the label has to say what the serving size is and what the servings per day should be. We want, and how many servings are in a container. We support that, we advocate for it, and we want good GMPs and good labeling in order to guide this. And we also, of course, want to keep it out of the hands of those 18 and under. And we want legislators to accept that. Some of them push for 21 because they try to make this match up against alcohol and tobacco and say, well, that's 21, so therefore, and fill in the blanks. But we fight hard to try to keep it at 18 and under. So the bottom line here is that we think that the families deserve the truth. We should honor them with the truth, and we're stand ready to help as best we can. The other area of agreement that I think we have with these families, and I'm not talking about the extremists, I'm not talking about the people that will never agree with us. I'm talking about the people that have suffered these losses, who truly want to know what the bottom line is, what the truth is. I think that the common thing that we agree on is there needs to be good regulations on kratom. I've heard family members say that. Now, their lawyers don't like it when they say that. They want bans. They want to be able to say, oh, look how bad this stuff is, and even these states are even banning it. That's their game, and that's the kind of narrative they want to push. But the reality is that families, if they want to know the truth, we need to have all the facts on the table, and in order to do it, we're in the midst of trying our best to identify every resource that we can gather in order to help in individual cases to determine what the actual cause of death was for those individuals that have suffered fatalities. And let science speak. If it's true that that product was adulterated or contaminated, then let's face that and then deal with it in terms of what the appropriate solution is. It's not that we ban something. No one called for a ban of Tylenol when you had the deaths in Chicago when someone deliberately adulterated a product and it killed people. They looked at solutions, and the solution was tamper-proof packaging. There are things that can be done and should be done when there are bad products that are put on the market. So that's where we are. The bottom line today is that we, as kratom consumers, are going to face continued daily attacks. And frankly, we're going to have to expect them to become more extreme. The name calling is going to continue. I'll give you a great example. I was invited to go to the Czech Republic. There was a serious discussion about what the right public policy should be. And there were some in the Czech Republic, including the Minister of Health, who were advocating for a ban, just like the FDA does. And in fact, he cited the fact that he had consulted with the FDA here in the United States, and that was the basis of his position. But people that were better informed, people that were more interested in finding the truth, listened, and we had this great exchange over there. And at the end of the day, the Czech Republic decided not to ban it, but they want to find the right regulatory approach, and we're working on it. What did the kratom danger awareness people say about when the report came out? And it's on their Facebook page. They said, because of Mac Hattow's lies. That's nonsense. I don't go over and say, oh, you should listen to Mac Hattow, because I am not a scientist. I did say to them that you should listen to the scientists who make their living by following the rigorous standards in order to produce verifiable science. When the kratom danger awareness people don't, and I know they're on listening here tonight, and I challenge you directly on this issue, when they don't like what a scientist says about kratom because they say, oh, it's just a lie, they name call, they take people like Jack Henningfield, who has committed his life to find good science and who consistently delivers good science on a variety of products. He's been at the front lines of every major pain relief medication in the last 50 years that has been submitted to the FDA. But because these people don't like what he says, they attack him personally. There are too many scientists today with too many voices being raised by them about the potential value of kratom, that kind of attack isn't going to work. Ad hominem attacks like that are going to rebound against them, and I welcome that, because it's about time we had serious discussions, not name calling. I've been called a murderer, because I advocate for responsible use and good regulations on kratom. Does that make sense to anyone except the hyperbole, except for the extremism that's being advocated in those corners? And it is extremism. That's the problem we're facing. And so I want to be, and I think we all should be, as sensitive as we can be and sympathetic and empathetic for people that suffer these losses. But that doesn't give them the pathway to lie about what's being done, or to misconstrue what the science is, or to ignore what the facts are in individual cases. And I can only say that we will continue to pursue what the science dictates and tells us. We've learned what the science says from the start of the kratom battle in 2016 to today. We've altered our position when the science dictated it. Originally, I was one of the great proponents saying, hey, 7-hydroxymetrogenine was an alkaloid, minor though it may be. It's not an alkaloid of the kratom plant. Science showed us that we needed to modify that position, and we did, because we want to be on the right side of science. Kratom is actually a metabolite that's produced by the two areas. One, by the drying process of kratom in order to let it be ground into powder. And of course, it occurs at that point at low levels that aren't significant. In 2016, there were creative, enterprising alchemists who decided that they could elevate 7-OH, because guess what? 7-OH is, in its pure form and a 1-to-1 ratio, very powerful, very dangerous, and should not be allowed on the marketplace. But it's not about a 1-to-1 ratio. It's about a minuscule amount of kratom. There was a study done by a NIDA-funded grant of over 320 products on the marketplace today. And the analysis was done as to how many of those have detectable levels of 7-hydroxymetrogenine. Zero of commercially available products. So 7-hydroxymetrogenine can be an important metabolite in terms of its effects on the body, but it's not the most powerful, and it is not the most powerful alkyl or a metabolite, or having an impact from a health perspective. Science tells us that. And you can't sit in a position and say you want to know the truth and you don't really look at the truth. So this is just one of those things that we're struggling with. But the interesting thing is that as locked and loaded as the FDA is on their kratom position, they're unwilling to move. They continue to republish propaganda. They don't care about the truth. They just keep restating all the health websites who are in lockstep with the FDA repeat it. But the Czech Republic went the other way, and they had all of the evidence and data that the FDA could muster, and they dropped over on the Czech Republic. In Indonesia, we now know that the Ministry of Health has rejected the BNN's position and said that it's a herbal medicine because the science, their own internal science, they didn't listen to, Jack Henningfield or Marilyn Eustace or Oliver Grundman, and that list goes on. They had their own scientists evaluate it, and they came to the conclusion. And then you see this is moving in Thailand as well when they decriminalized it, and Malaysia now is moving this direction. So what is it? What is it that the FDA knows that they don't know? What is it that the kratom danger awareness people know that these countries and these entities don't know? And of course, we know the answer to that: the follow the money. And we know in the FDA's case that they want kratom to be a new drug application product because they don't make any money on dietary supplements. They don't get user fees. They don't get to hose these companies every year in doing that. And so obviously, and then of course the other issues I already talked about is the money becomes the root of the evil of driving to a conclusion that's not supported by good science. I said earlier that we can expect a continuation of the FDA doing these things. They will. They're going to continue to propagandize the kratom community. They're going to continue to attack us. They're going to continue to scrape every bit of data they can from social media. They're collecting data. They're trying to justify and horse up their effort against it. And it's about time they're held accountable. And we're doing our best here at the American Kratom Association to hold them accountable. We'll continue to do it. I hope we stop shooting ourselves in the foot. There are voices, and I respect the fact that we live in a country where everyone can have their opinion. There are voices in the kratom community that have to be tuned out. When you know who they are, you see them. You see them with their extreme views, just like we have extremists that are opposed to us. We have our own extremists, and they need to be tuned out because they're not acting responsibly. And I've welcomed any kind of dialogue, any kind of legitimate discourse where it can be done with respect, with civility, without the use of obvious, ridiculous profanity to attack people. And we're going to continue to offer that. But until then, tune those people out because it's just not making any sense to do it. And I know they don't like that because they want to be relevant in this discussion, but they exclude themselves by their actions. And I hope the community will accept that advice in the spirit that it's intended because we want to protect this community going forward. So I'll stop there. We'll open it up for questions and Ryan, I'll let you kind of handle that and kind of select which questions we need to respond to.
Of course, and you touched on it briefly regarding 75 reports. Can you estimate how many are related to unlawful health claims or undisclosed combination or adulteration?
So all we looked at was the health claims, the therapeutic claims that were on a website. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act prohibits a vendor from making any therapeutic claims for the sale of their products if they're not supported by a new drug application. So you can't make those claims. And all we did was look at that because we don't have the resources in order to take and test these products in each individual case. Of the documentation that we provided to the FDA of these 75 companies, it was all deliberate marketing activities that were going on where they were mislabeling their products. Now, some of this is hard for the vendors because if they maintain a blog post or a comment section on their products on their website and some consumer gets on and says, hey, that really helped me with my back pain, that is an illegal therapeutic claim which is associated with that vendor. And so the vendor has to aggressively review all of the comments and not allow those kinds of things to come up on the website. What we focused on were those companies who were deliberately putting in therapeutic claims in order to induce consumers to purchase them and their products. And remember, the FDA's biggest complaint right now today is that people are self-medicating for opioid addiction. And that's their biggest beef with us And at least that's ostensibly what it is. They tell members of Congress that all the time. Now, if you step back from their attack, saying that, look at what the NIDA people say. The NIDA people say that it is in fact a significant harm reduction tool that many in the harm reduction community are looking at and recognizing kratom can be a valuable tool. I mean, it's just your perspective. The FDA has been prosecuting this anti-dietary supplement, anti-botanical supplements for decades. In fact, if you look at the pathway that was created by Congress to allow for botanical supplements, plant-based supplements, in order to get approval, which is a specific pathway which is separate from dietary supplements using the NDIN process, there have been 800 applications over the last 15 years submitted to the FDA using the FDA portal for botanical supplements. 500 of those got far enough along to get INDs, meaning investigational new drug protocols, that would dictate exactly what they had to prove. And that's a significant investment. It's a commitment by the vendor to the product that they're trying to market. And in 15 years, 800 applications, 500 that had a NDI protocol agreement with the FDA, two have been approved. Statistically, that's not possible, but that's the way that the FDA treats it because they're biased against botanical supplements and kratom. They're biased against dietary supplements. If they could repeal in some way, and thank goodness they don't have this authority, they get rid of the 50,000 dietary supplements, the billions of dollars that comes to the economy from them, and 80% of the American people use dietary supplements and vitamins to maintain their health and well-being. The FDA doesn't care about any of that. It's all about their regulatory power that they have over the American people.
Great, some good statements from Kenny. Thank you. And let's see, what the FDA guidelines as they are, does putting serving size and quantity also add risks for even the most diligent and responsible vendors?
So this is an issue that, and I'll give you my personal opinion on this based on what the regulations, the requirements are for dietary supplement labeling. The vendor protects themselves by putting on their label what their recommended serving size is. Now, they obviously should have some basis to make that conclusion. But if you don't put anything on it, then the individual's left to their own devices to figure out how much to take. And the vendor opens themselves up to significant product liability claims if they're not advising them what the amount of their product that they should be taking. I mean, it's easy to misguide this. I mean, I wish I had one here, but if you have a tincture bottle and you look at it and it's only that tall, the instinct of a consumer is to just slog it down. And the truth is that the label says, take half a bottle as one serving, right? So that it's important that labeling be informative and allow for responsible consumption of a kratom product. So we fully support that kind of labeling, and in fact, put it into the KCPA regulations that we're advocating for states to pass, requiring that the label include that kind of information. It is a protection for the vendors and for the consumers, because then they can responsibly use it based on the advice that's given on the label.
It's great. And what's your suggestion on how to approach a retail establishment selling kratom in Ziploc baggies?
Don't buy kratom from them. That's the first thing you should do. The marketplace is dictated by consumer behavior. And unfortunately, there are a couple of things that work in this space. One is that, consumers are smart, and so price sensitivity is a factor. There are many kratom vendors, thousands of them, who are buying directly from farmers. Now, they've never met those farmers, but if you talk to these vendors, they say, oh, I trust Farmer X because I've been dealing with him for years, and he's trustworthy and a wonderful person, and they act like they're friends because they've talked on Facebook and placed orders. I will tell you, having been there, that there is a high likelihood that Farmer X isn't testing their product, not a bit. And testing's expensive, and it increases the price of a kratom product. And so if you're buying, not only just in a Ziploc bag, even if they have a pre-printed label, they stick on it, that's not the way to buy a kratom product. It should follow good manufacturing practices, and you will not buy a GMP qualified product in a Ziploc bag. You just will not. It has to be done in a way that's professional, and it has to meet the standards for the actual manufacturing. Under the FDA standards for every dietary supplement, and we hope that kratom gets into that category, they are required at the conclusion of their manufacturing process to actually test the product right there, the finished good product, and make sure that it's free from contaminants, there hasn't been cross-contamination, that it's exactly what it says it is in terms of the product that they're marketing, and there can't be a lot of room for error. And I know that there are vendors who, and I hear from them all the time, they say, you're trying to put me out of business. Yes, I am. I want them out of business because they are the ticking time bomb in this industry. And if people are selling kratom in Ziploc bags, stop buying it. And if you have a vendor that's selling it in any retail establishment you go into, express your viewpoint. Tell them, stop this. This is hurting the industry, and it's hurting our cause, because we want to be protected. We want kratom to remain in the marketplace, and we can't let our enemies use this kind of irresponsible marketing to be the thing that brings us down.
Thanks, Mac. And if you can give us an update on East Feliciana, and also just what is the likelihood of a state ban attempt again next year in Louisiana?
Oh, 100% they're going to try again, and we'll be in there fighting. This is a tough issue because you have very powerful anti-kratom forces that are at work in the form of the local sheriffs and law enforcement people in Louisiana who do not understand kratom at all. But what they've done is they've built on this house of cards their argument that, oh, there are kids that are taking kratom and they're getting addicted and it's harming our children. That's the mantra that they use. Now, unless that kratom product is adulterated, it is very unlikely that a kid's ever going to touch it because it tastes so bad. And it's very unlikely that they're going to buy it, because guess what? It is a lot cheaper to go down in the corner and buy weed or heroin or something else, because kratom doesn't give you that euphoric high unless you buy it and consume it in such huge quantities that, and by the way, you're spending so much money that it's just not economically feasible for that to be sustainable. But these law enforcement people who are the gods in these local parishes and juries in Louisiana have bought into this narrative, and they're wrong. The science contradicts them, but they're not really listening to that right now. We have a tough battle in Louisiana. We're going to continue to fight it. East Feliciano, if you watch the hearing, we submitted volumes of information to them. We showed them what the science is. And somehow those jury members, the police jury members in East Feliciana Parish, somehow knew more than the 12 experts at the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence. They knew more than the Secretary of Health, the Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS. They knew more than the DEA knows about kratom. And they independently came to this conclusion. Why? Because their sheriff told them to. So we're going to continue to fight there. We're going to have to do it. It's a slog. It is enormously difficult to do. And we just have to have Louisiana residents be willing to step up and push hard. But you saw how you were ignored. Don't be daunted by that. We just have to come back fighting harder and make sure that we can fight this battle. We're going to be back next year in the Louisiana legislature, and we're going to be fighting this battle. And we got it through the House. We got stopped in the Senate. And it was unfortunate because a deal that we brokered and thought we had done was abrogated by legislators who obviously don't hold a lot of respect for a deal when you strike one. So we'll be back, and we're going to do our best to fight there in Louisiana.
Great, thank you. And should we be worried about Nevada? Will the rally on the 20th help these concerns?
Absolutely, it will. Here's the landscape in Nevada. We had a 2/3 vote on a strengthened Kratom Consumer Protection Act accepted with Republican and Democrat votes in the Nevada legislature. You had a governor who is a former law enforcement official who bought into the narrative of the Metro Police Department in Las Vegas and vetoed the bill. And worse, in his veto statement, he said, this is a substance that should be banned. And so now we're going to have to fight harder, because it would not be too big a leap to expect that the Board of Pharmacy will follow the governor's lead and they will move to ban kratom. So this rally that we have coming up on the 20th is critically important, because it will highlight the fact that veterans are using kratom in order to help them, to alleviate the pain and the suffering that comes. I've told people this before, that I was in Las Vegas couple of months ago at meetings, and I got into the Uber, and the Uber driver said to me, because he saw my first name as they do on Uber, he said, Mac, that's an unusual name. He said, are you Mac Haddo? And I said, yes, I am. He goes, kratom saved my life. He said, I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I got banged up hard. He said, I was on all the painkillers that were whacking me out that the VA prescribed. He said, someone told me to try kratom. It saved my life. And that's the truth of the matter. And responsible use of kratom is going to be the thing that will continue to save people's lives, to improve the quality of life. And that's what we need to push when we get to Nevada. So yes, this is a critical time to honor the forgotten but not gone veterans anti-suicide group, highlighting the fact that they have found kratom to be a very effective tool in the arsenal that they have, but they advocate for veterans. And that's an important message for us to be able to tell to legislators in the state of Nevada.
That's great. And I want to thank everyone for the comments. They've used the Q&A to make some really good comments, tell their stories. Thank you for that. And I'm seeing our last question is any movement on the KCPA in Pennsylvania?
Sure. We've been working. We had a fabulous informational hearing with the Senate and House members talking about kratom and some other products. And it was a magnificent reception. These legislators got it. The way the legislative process works is that they will go through in the fall and start to develop the legislative package. And we're hopeful it'll be more robust than what was retreated to last year. So we're working hard on it, and we expect that Pennsylvania is going to come to the right conclusion. We got lots of other states that are still in play, by the way. Pennsylvania is an important one. Currently, the legislatures that are still in session, for which there is a chance that we'll get the KCPA passed, are North Carolina, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Now, some of these are 2-year sessions, by the way, so Massachusetts probably won't be acted on until January, but we had a great hearing up there, very receptive legislative audience on that. Wisconsin, we think that one's going to be great. So we're going to continue to work hard to educate legislators in order to help have them understand that the proper regulatory scheme, and this, as I said earlier, most of the anti-kratom people believe that because the science won't justify scheduling, they at least ought to regulate it. And if they were to focus on that and work together with us, we could come to some excellent regulatory schemes that will protect consumers. But they're driven by the extremists in their group that are locked and loaded to just name call, attack people, and not really be responsible in terms of the rhetoric that's used here. And you know, I advocate for people coming together and finding common ground in order for us to work together on it. I'm not going to call anyone those vicious names that they call us on our side of the aisle. We're not going to attack them personally because they hold these views, but we encourage them to come to at least evaluate based on the science where we are. So I think that's the bottom line. Our challenge is that we need to work together cooperatively as best we can in order to get to good public policy. And these states where we're operating, and Ohio was another one, I'm sorry, I missed that. And we're also alive in Michigan. So we're doing a lot in order to move the needle here to find a number of states that will add to the 11 states that we've already had the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed, much to the consternation of some of our anti-kratom people. But hey, I think the truth is that science prevails, and that's what we want to be the thing that dictates good public policy. Follow the science.
That's great. And thank you all very much for this evening. And Mac, did you have any other closing comments, or I think we'll plan on meeting again soon?
Yeah, I would just encourage everyone to look for some important things that are happening, because we're seeing some great progress when people are able to rationally evaluate the science. We're going to see movement at the federal level with the refiling of the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act. You can look for that to happen relatively soon. We've made great progress over the last couple of weeks to get that in position to be filed. Just remember, we're going to continue to fight the disinformation campaign of the FDA. And this is the hypocrisy of the FDA. They actually have a webpage up where they talk about disinformation that people are circulating about COVID and about some other therapies that people are using. They're guilty of that kind of misinformation about kratom, because their opinion has been repudiated by the science. And yet they continue to repeat their opinion about it, which is not grounded in good science. And we have a legitimate expectation that the FDA would tell the truth about these things. And they're not. They're simply misleading people and trying to recharacterize kratom in terms of its effectiveness. And just the prime example, if you go to the FDA website today, they still have up there Dr. Scott Gottlieb's unsubstantiated claim that kratom is an opioid. It's not. It's not by chemistry or by law or by plant genetics. It is not. And yet it continues to be up there. An agency that's interested in the truth and making sure that we don't have disinformation out there about any product wouldn't be the perpetrator of the great lie that misstates the truth about any product that's out there. So we just have to be aware that that's going to continue to happen. And we need to, as best we can, counter it with not only that repeating the good science, the legitimate science on this, but call them to account. And we're working on a project now that will do just that, that we're going to call the FDA to account. And Commissioner Califf, who, himself complained that when he was formerly the FDA commissioner during the Obama administration, when he came back in under the Biden administration, hadn't seen an inch of progress when it comes to CBD regulation, which we all know is ubiquitous everywhere, and the FDA still fights for it to be banned. And with kratom, he said there needs to be new statutory authorities. And he said that about 6 or 8 months ago, and there's been no proposal for statutory authorities that he claims that he needs at the FDA in order to regulate kratom properly. And so we're going to provide that to him with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act at the federal level. We're making great progress. This is an exciting time. When you look back at where we started in 2016, when we thought it was Katie bar the door, we're done. We're today thriving. The consumer population, the kratom consumer population is growing, and we're making great progress internationally with the truth prevailing about kratom. And we continue to have to try to educate the FDA and bring them to the trough of truth in order to get the right policy position here in the United States about kratom.
That's a great spot to end. Thank you, Mac, and we will be in touch with you all very soon.